Welcome to Resolving Reality. My name is Emmett, the creator of the resolvingreality.com website and host of this podcast, Resolving Reality Radio. Resolving Reality is an independent Irish media platform that examines national and global issues, featuring opinions and topics not covered in the mainstream media, including the alternative, the politically incorrect, the undiscovered and the ignored. Check out the website for all our social media links and platforms, which you can find in the footer on each page. Follow us on Twitter at ResolvingOr, both capital Rs. Find us on YouTube, where you can listen to the podcasts, but also watch our video content. And don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. We are on Mixcloud, but if you prefer to listen to the podcast in higher quality WAV audio, click on the SoundCloud icon to visit the Resolving Reality SoundCloud profile, where you can download the episodes in high quality as well. Resolving Reality Radio is now on Stitcher and iTunes, plus check out our BitChute profile and you will find all those links right there on the website resolvingreality.com. This is Resolving Reality Radio. In this 6th episode of Resolving Reality Radio, I speak to DJ, podcaster, public speaker and author Mark Devlin. Mark has written 2 popular books on the subject of control and manipulation in the music industry called Musical Truth and Musical Truth Volume 2. In this interview, we discuss some of the history of the music industry, the high-profile acts who have dominated the scene, and how control has always been part of the agenda. We also cover the promotion of the use of drugs like LSD and Ecstacy by the system, the connections between military intelligence services and the music industry, how the hip-hop scene was destroyed as a genre, dark occultism in the modern-day music scene, the behaviour that the so-called artists of today are promoting, and some of the big names who've criticised the industry over the years. Visit Mark's website, markdevlin.co.uk, for more information on him, his books, podcasts, plus his Twitter and YouTube profiles. Stay tuned to Resolving Reality Radio. Hello, Mark, and welcome to Resolving Reality Radio.
Hi, mate. Good to be on with you.
Great. Thanks very much. I appreciate it. I know you're a busy man. You've got a lot of stuff going on. So, it's really cool that you're, taking time to speak to me. This topic, the main focus of your work is control and manipulation in the music industry. I know it's quite a large topic and it kind of fits into the general control system in the world pretty much. But to give it the interview a main focus, I suppose there's control, manipulation, and also the other subtopics, things like mind control, paedophilia, Satanism, and we'll try to fit as many as we can into the hour. But just to start off, first of all, this whole topic of control and manipulation, this isn't a new thing, is it? I mean, it's been around since the beginning of the industry, hasn't it?
Well, it has, yeah. And you just mentioned there the music industry and paedophilia, mind control and Satanism in the same sentence. If anybody is listening to this thinking, wait, what? What did he just say? And they're not aware that these things are intrinsically weaved into the fabric of the industry, then they've got a few shocks coming, I would suggest, as I did when I first started delving into this material. What would it be now? Over 8 years ago, I started digging into this. And so during the course of all that research, I've come to very much comprehend that the entertainment industry, consisting of Hollywood movies, television, aspects of the mainstream media, professional sports, and of course the music industry, anything that is devised to keep people occupied during their leisure time and not thinking about important things that are going on elsewhere in the world is completely manipulated and controlled. And in fact, these industries are used as vehicles to mind control large numbers of people, to sow certain perceptions, belief systems, value systems in the general mindset of the public, and to put dark occult subliminal influences into the public consciousness as well. Of course, none of these things are told to us blatantly. We're not told that that's what these industries are all about. But when you get into the research and when you start looking at the evidence which is available to anyone that chooses to go there, it becomes blatantly clear that this is what it's all about. And when you think about it, if we have a control system that is hell-bent on suppressing and enslaving and controlling the rest of humanity, why would they miss the incredible opportunities that are offered through the entertainment industry to really get into people's mindsets and to the very core of their spirituality in many cases. These are perfect vehicles because people's guards are down when they think that all they're doing is listening to a favorite piece of music, going to see a favorite band, watching a movie at the cinema, watching a favorite TV show. Nobody's expecting to be influenced in this way through these things. So it's an ingenious way of achieving it. And of course, there's the added bonus for the control system in that people actually pay for their own mind control. They pay to go and see these bands. They pay to go and see these films. So it's been going on forever. And many researchers will tell you that the very reason for the corporate music industry being established in the first place, way back in the 1950s, I guess you trace it back to, in both America and Britain and other parts of the world, was because of the incredible opportunities that are offered to get to that large number of people through these vehicles. So we've got many examples of this having been done, and we can look at these different genres, these different phases, going all the way back to the rock and roll era with Elvis Presley, and kicked off with Bill Haley and the Comets, and then going through artists like Little Richard and Buddy Holly and Chuck Berry and people like this. And then over in the UK, the emergence of Cliff Richard in his very early days, who was modelled as a kind of British Elvis. Then going into the 60s, you had groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Who and the Kinks and all these groups coming out of Britain, the Animals. Over in the States, you had the emergence of the hippie Laurel Canyon counterculture scene, which has been very well documented. All the groups that came out of that, like the Doors and the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, all these groups, the Mamas and the Papas. And there's so much evidence to show that at each stage of the way, there's been manipulations, there's been aspects of mind control, aspects of social engineering going on. And much of this has occurred at the hands of the military intelligence communities, who have had their fingers in the pie of the entertainment industry going all the way through. So you can look at some of the early record labels that first came out as vehicles for these artists, the likes of RCA, EMI, Parlophone, Decca. And what you find is that many of these labels have a history steeped in military operations themselves. Many of these companies were used to perfect radio systems and sonar systems, this kind of thing, weapons defense systems on behalf of the military. And them becoming record labels was like a subsidiary aspect to their core activity. One of the classic ones is RCA, which stands for Radio Corporation of America, which was actually involved in the US Navy. It came out of the US Naval Institution. So that's how that record label got its start. And you see many different examples of this. And when we get into the individual personnel that were put out there as many of the prominent artists, you look at some of the family connections, the bloodlines that these people come from, and you look at the affiliations and connections that they had, and time again, you find links going into military intelligence. On this side of the Atlantic, it would be MI5, MI6, links to the Tavistock Institute, which is a social engineering think tank. And then over in the States, you've got endless links going into the CIA, the FBI, the Pentagon, different secret societies like Freemasonry and Skull and Bones and all of this. And there's just so many examples. I've gone into them in my book. There's many other researchers now putting out information of this type. And it casts a very different light on what the music industry actually is, which is rather more than just harmless fun and entertainment, it turns out, unfortunately and inconveniently. But there it is.
Yeah. And you prefaced it quite well there, and there are so many examples, and we wouldn't have time to go through them all. But sometimes you can see this more superficial aspects of the control system, right in front of your face. And we've talked about, the examples, or you've mentioned the examples of control and how far it goes. And obviously the key is getting into people's heads and affecting their emotions. And even when you look at how, Beatlemania back in the day, like as you pointed out in the book, these group of working class lads from the north of England, Liverpool, all of a sudden are treated as gods. And you have I think that and probably Elvis was the beginnings of this idolizing people and hysteria on a mass scale.
Sure. And the public relations version of the story, the kind of Wikipedia official account of things, would have you believe that Elvis just rose to this position through being a great artist and working really hard and crossing his fingers for good luck. And it could have been anyone, but it just happened to be Elvis. And the same thing happened with the Beatles. They would have you believe that it's just four working class lads from Liverpool that formed a band, played a few gigs, worked really hard, crossed their fingers for good luck. And the next thing you know, they're causing hysteria among teenagers all over the world. It doesn't just happen like that. These artists are selected for these roles and these careers are given to them. I know that's very difficult for fans of these acts to accept, and it doesn't take anything away from the musical talent of these people. Obviously, they're hugely talented. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to maintain those positions year after year. But it's because they're so talented, and it's because they exhibit musical skill that they're elevated to these positions in the first place. But nobody gets to those kind of positions on their own terms. It's on the industry's terms. They want you, they choose you. And if you're not part of their club, you quite simply don't reach those kind of dizzy heights. You know, with the Beatles, we got stories of, in the early days, young girls being so taken by the energy of these groups' performances that they literally could not control their bowels and they were peeing themselves. And there's stories of rivers of urine just flowing down some of these concert venues through all these girls just completely losing control of all their faculties. So what is going on here? There's some kind of ritual magic, it seems, that a group can have this kind of effect on people to cause them to lose their minds in this way, and all the screaming that took place. Certainly there's stories that in the early days, the Beatles and other groups used to hire crowds of kids to come along and scream. So they were paid to do this. There's an account of a busload of schoolgirls from the Bronx in New York that were apparently brought to JFK Airport when the Beatles arrived to first perform on the Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964. And apparently these girls were paid to scream. And then, of course, the news footage went out. Everyone else saw it and thought, oh my God, this group must be incredible. Look at all these girls screaming. But it seems that at a certain point, the screaming and the hysteria became a very real thing. And that's the kind of hold that these groups were able to have over large numbers of people. And that's never really ended. You know, every generation has its own versions of it. In the 1970s, you had teenagers losing their minds over the Bay City Rollers. In the 1980s, you had girls losing their minds over groups like Duran Duran and Spandau Ballet and Bros. And these days, I don't know who the hell it is. What, One Direction a few years ago, I suppose. Justin Bieber, bloody Shawn Mendes, whoever these people are these days. But, you know, generation after generation, we just see the same thing being rolled out. It's chosen ones. It's the artists that the industry has decided they're going to promote, and these artists push agendas. So it's not just a case of them putting out records. In so many cases, there's extracurricular activities going on where they're pushing certain ideas and certain value systems and stuff as a sideline to what they're doing musically. And again, there's endless examples of this.
Yeah, and as well as that, I mean, you said there are so many examples of this. It's the constant pattern being wheeled out over and over again. And before we go into occultism and some of the symbology with the great bands over the years, especially back in the 70s, you know, for those of us in the know who understand there is a control system pulling the strings, it's like they're projecting their ideologies onto people in a very direct way, as in they themselves want to be idolized. And they're trying to create this society where people are idolizing acts. It's a constant theme, and I know you've mentioned it in your lectures, where we need to snap out of this whole idea of bowing down to people that we've never really met or we don't actually know personally.
That's right. You just got to stop putting these people up on pedestals and revering them as gurus and role models, because this is actually a military-grade tactic, as I've also mentioned in some of my public talks. During the Cold War years, the KGB actually had a strategy whereby they created what they called false heroes and role models. And there's documentation available to show that this was done. And these people were implanted in prominent positions to get people to look up to them, to hang on their every word, to follow them, whatever path they led them down. And all the time, this was a military-style operation designed to get people to give their power away and only listen to these pre-selected, approved public heroes.
You know, if we kind of go into the occultism side of things, you know, if we look at some of the more famous bands that you mentioned in the books, and again, we don't have time to go through their whole stories, but even just to give an overview on this particular topic of those big bands, you had Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, and the Rolling Stones. There's traces of occultism in their work, you know, whether we're talking about album covers or in their music. Do you think this was coming from the acts themselves, or were they encouraged to put this into their work? How do you think this worked out, Mark?
I think it was probably a case of the controllers of these acts coercing them into embracing this dark occult symbolism. And we saw that playing out big time in the 1960s, particularly with the teachings of Aleister Crowley, this notorious British occultist from the Victorian era. I mean, this guy is like a friggin' rock star in his own right, and his life was all about an early expression of sex and drugs and rock and roll. It was all there. And then when the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and people like Led Zeppelin came along, they just fully embraced the teachings of Crowley and started weaving it into their songs and their album covers and things like that. Also, the Doors, they've got a sort of bust, like a cast bust of Aleister Crowley on the sleeves of one of their albums. And you've got groups like, or individuals like Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin, who bought Aleister Crowley's house famously, Boleskine House up there in Loch Ness, Scotland. And so these groups really kind of embraced this guy's ideologies. David Bowie is another one. He had a song, Quicksand, which is all about Crowley, and Elton John was into him as well. But I do think that these groups were pushed in that direction because it was part of what was intended to be achieved during those times. Particularly in the 60s, it was a time of great social change, and there were so many different agendas going on to lead young people down certain pre-approved paths. And groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and all these American acts were very much playing their part in the mindset of those times. So it was the emergence of LSD, which is the drugs aspect of it. There were changing attitudes towards sex and family, and there was all this psychedelic rock music going on. So it's the full package of sex and drugs and rock and roll, with occultism thrown into the mix as well. You had all this talk of the age of Aquarius going on at the end of the 60s, and all these different Eastern sort of occult systems that were being pushed. So it was all agendas, and it very much suited the times, and it was all done at the hands of those that direct these industries, I would say. And the groups were just pretty much along for the ride, doing what they were told.
Mm-hmm. And you know, you mentioned LSD there, so we could segue into the story of Jim Morrison and the Doors and his background. And, you know, also maybe you could tell us as well why the music industry would be interested in using drugs to kind of, promote certain agendas or change how people think.
Yeah, well, the story of Jim Morrison is often told, and it's very familiar now, but just to recap on it, it turns out that Jim Morrison's father was a US Naval Admiral, George Stephen Morrison, and he was in charge of the fleet of ships that was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident that basically springboarded the Vietnam War and America's involvement in that part of Southeast Asia. So you got Jim Morrison, who was positioned as this anti-establishment, anti-war rock god, an icon of the youthful generation of the time. And yet you've got his dad pretty much starting the Vietnam War. How do you reconcile those two things? Well, people argue about it endlessly, and fans of Jim Morrison will say, well, he was just rebelling against his father. He didn't stand for his value system, and his act with the Doors was his way of sticking it to his dad and to the control system. But I wouldn't be so sure that that's the case. If Jim Morrison was an isolated incident, you could certainly make the claim that that's what was going on, but he was far from that. when you get into the work of Dave McGowan, who did a lot of research into the Laurel Canyon district of LA during the counterculture years of the 1960s, you get endless examples of prominent musicians who were at the forefront of the counterculture, the psychedelic revolution. And when you look into who their families were, and specifically who their dads were, you just find example after example of high-ranking personnel within the military intelligence communities. And, it just goes on and on and on. It's very difficult to find a musician whose dad wasn't involved in all of that in some way. So really, the only logical conclusion you can come to, if you're going to let go of your fan worship and your misty-eyed nostalgia of those years and your favorite groups and be realistic about it, is that the entire operation was done at the hands of military intelligence aspects of military intelligence, and that's what the entertainment industry was all about during these times. And LSD was used to change social attitudes. What the social engineers wanted to do at the time was to change long-held attitudes towards family. They wanted to break up traditional family units because this provides an element of cohesion within society where you've got strong families all supporting each other, all sticking together. If you can break that up and atomize individuals so that they feel alienated from the rest of their family, they feel as if there's a generational divide between them and their parents, they feel as if these new attitudes towards sex and drugs and permissiveness are the way to go, then you're going to create discord between, different aspects of families. And that's exactly what went on when young people dropped out of society, started hanging out in communes, started taking all these drugs. And I know there's going to be a lot of apologists for psychedelics, and you'll always find people that say, what's so wrong with these things? Because when you take LSD and MDMA, ecstasy, and so many of these other things, magic mushrooms and such, it opens up your spirituality, your consciousness, and you can see the world for what it really is. You break through all the bullshit and all the hype, and you can understand all the deception that goes on. And I'm sure there's that aspect to it. But it seems that people react in different ways to these kind of influences. And for every person that you find who's had an amazing transformative experience on LSD, you're going to find someone else who will tell you that it ruined their life. It will tell you that it led to mental disorders, psychosis and memory loss and schizophrenia. It's linked to all these conditions, and people will say they became addicted to it, it screwed up their life, and they were no longer able to formulate meaningful relationships and all this kind of thing. And it would seem that the whole exercise was, to a large extent, a massive social experiment at the hands of the social engineers. I certainly think that they wanted to see what would happen if they got large numbers of people tripping out to psychedelics and listening to all this new music. They were very much lab rats and guinea pigs, and that whole 60s scene was used as a giant experiment. And I think the social engineers would have been very happy with the results, and so they've rolled out the same kind of agendas ever since, in different places, using different drugs at different times with different generations, but with the aim always being the same: to fracture and divide society, to drive a wedge between the generations, and to get people dependent on drugs and all these different social movements, all of it on their terms. So they're calling the shots, they're in control. All these hippies and all these people that attach themselves to any of these social movements think they're making a statement on their own terms. They think they're being rebellious, they think they're being anti-establishment, but they don't really question where it is that all these drugs come from, where all the music comes from, and who's really controlling all these aspects of the dynamic.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lesson in that, a life lesson for all of us, that, if you're going to follow crowds and you're going to give over your consciousness to some sort sort of a movement, you better be sure that there's some intelligence there, and often the case there isn't.
Well, there's military intelligence.
There you go. And yeah, another aspect as well, tying right into that, is that, say, for example, when you mentioned the 60s, there was the time of the Vietnam War, which you mentioned in the book, and it's no coincidence that the military intelligence services would be interested in getting the general public to stop protesting and stop rising up against the system, and to just be out of their mind on drugs and, lose their kind of fighting spirit as well.
Well, that's right. That was another aspect to it. You had the Vietnam War being pushed, and American society, or certainly people of a certain age, were being persuaded to support the war. But at the same time, you had the youthful generation being persuaded to drop out of society, say, they don't want any part in what's going on with their parents' generation, and they just want to hang around, do drugs, have sex, and, just hang out in these squalid hippie communes. And so when you've got a generation doing that, just flopping about and being tripped out, they're not going to be any kind of threat to the establishment. They're not going to rebel. They're not going to take up arms and provide any kind of physical resistance to what's going on. That was another aspect to it, of course.
I just think as well, so before we move into the hip-hop scene topic, which is a great area as well you covered in the book, there's also the for this last section about drugs in the industry, you also covered how, the dance music scene and the rise of ecstasy and MDMA. And I'm just realised here off the top of my head that, we had the first Gulf War kicked off at 1989 or 90 or whatever it was. And that was very similar to the beginning of the ecstasy phenomenon. I wonder if the world controllers knew what they were planning next and decided to, instead of waiting till the general public start protesting like they did in the 60s before taking action, maybe they decided on a preemptive sort of psychological strike to get everyone out of their mind on the love drug at parties and burnt out with serotonin, low serotonin levels, and off the streets protesting the upcoming, Persian Gulf War, the first one.
Well, I'm sure they did, because to my mind, the acid house scene and the rave scene, the whole dance music revolution that grew up out of London in 1987-88. 1988 was dubbed by the media of the time as the second summer of love. There's a big red flag clue for you, because what it was effectively a repackaging of what had been done in the 60s in the United States with LSD and psychedelic rock, just represented to a new generation over here in Britain in the 1980s, with MDMA, ecstasy replacing LSD, and electronic dance music, the very early sounds of acid house, replacing psychedelic rock. So you had all these big raves and festivals, which were just a reboot of the Monterey Pop Festival and Woodstock and Altamont and all these big hippie festivals that had taken place. They were just rolling out the same program, and they wanted to see what would happen if they dumped it on Britain at the tail end of the 1980s. So you had Thatcherism at the time. Britain was a pretty grim and austere place. You had the poll tax riots, which occurred in 1990, right around the time that this scene was getting going. And as you say, the first Gulf War, the beginnings of that were in 1990 as well. And then early 91, the boys went in and military action started. And by that point, this scene was very much full throttle. And it got exported out of Britain to other areas in Europe. I'm not sure how quickly Ireland got it. You can probably fill me in on that. But it certainly got exported to all these other different markets. And America was very late to the party, forgive the pun, because it was only in the last 10 years or so, I would say round about 2008, that electronic dance music took off in a big way in the United States. So it's as if this entire agenda was perfected in Europe and elsewhere, and then America got it very late on. And they're certainly doing a number on young people in America now with this whole scene. It's being used to push transhumanism now, but that's a whole different story. So yeah, there's so many parallels between what went on before and what this scene has been all about. And of course, middle-aged, grizzled old ravers that look back on the 80s and early 90s with great nostalgia and with this, misty sort of glint in their eye, are horrified to hear any kind of suggestion that this scene was not raw and organic and grassroots as we've all been led to believe it was. But I've got my suspicions about what it was intended to do. I certainly go into detail about it in the book and have done in previous talks. And it is what it is. You know, it's not as if this is the only scene they've done this to. It's not as if ravers need feel that they've been singled out to be mugged off and deceived, because it's happened with everything. The punk and new wave scene was to a large extent contrived and controlled. The whole hippie scene was, as we've said, heavy rock, heavy metal, same way. The hip-hop scene, same way. You know, they've done it to all these different genres. The tactics differ somewhat, but the aim is always the same, to use these music scenes and movements as mechanisms of social control.
Yeah, and for the listeners as well, you know, we're outlining it here for people that, you know, the key to all of it is emotions and of course hedonism. And, you know, if something makes you feel good, it doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing in the long run. And a lot of people fall into that trap, you know, and then it's not till they get older till they start to kind of sit up and look at things and question them more. And well, to move into you brought up there a minute ago, you brought up hip hop, and this whole subject of control and manipulation. It's not just about individuals, is it? There's also examples of how whole genres were changed. You know, they started off as something good, and then they were later co-opted and watered down. And I just want to actually preface this bit quickly with a piece from the book, and it's where you're talking about people and their opinions on the hip hop scene. And you said, and I quote, "I would challenge anyone to find me a mainstream hip-hop record from the past 10 years which dealt with anything other than these general subject areas: having promiscuous sex, partying in the club, throwing wads of cash in the air, girls with fat asses, a rapper's superior financial status over his or her peers, the possessions of gold rims," and there's many more examples there, which was hilarious, and it really sums up what hip-hop has become now. But I mean, from what I've heard about it, it wasn't my genre, but I heard that in the beginning, this was it was a proper art form with something to say, wasn't it?
It was, and it's really tragic what's happened to it. So if you take it back all the way to the early 70s, around about 1973 is acknowledged as the time when this whole art form, this whole lifestyle got started, because hip-hop isn't just about rap music. It's acknowledged that there are 5 elements to it, and that would be graffiti art, b-boying or breaking, the style of dancing that goes with the music. Initially, the music, when it was played, involved DJs like Kool Herc, who's acknowledged as the instigator of this scene, who used to run sound systems in the Bronx area of New York. And he would play old soul and funk records and kind of Afro-Latin dance records, and cut up the breaks section, the breakdown, the percussive break in the record, and chop it up using 2 turntables. So that was the initial musical element of hip-hop, and you'd have the b-boy dancers break into it. You'd have graffiti art as part of the thing as well. The turntablism itself was an aspect of the art form. It was using turntables as a musical instrument. And you had what have I missed here? The turntablism, the dancing, the graffiti. There's another element as well, which I'm going to kick myself for forgetting. But they all converge into this 5th element as well, which is acknowledged as knowledge of self. It's kind of a spiritual component to it. And a lot of commentators, such as this guy called Black Dot, who I interviewed a while back on one of my podcasts, and Professor Griff of Public Enemy has talked about this, speak of how what was happening in the Bronx at the time was a reawakening of spiritual traditions, which were carried in the DNA of black people that had been brought over as slaves from Africa to America. And they were reawakening these primal kind of things that were built into their very being, aspects of their being. And the hip-hop scene was, you know, African dance traditions, tribal sort of rituals that were being reborn in this new urban landscape. So you had the dancing, you had the art, you had the musical elements of it, and everyone all coming together. And that's what made the origins of this scene so authentic and so real to so many people. So in the early days, you had rap music, which came off the back of it. Of course, that's the other element. How could I forget that? The spoken word element of it, of course, which came to be known as rap music. The first rap record acknowledged, the first commercial hit, was Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang in 1979. And then as the 70s went into the 80s, you found with many of these early rap records, they were very consciously aware, and you had meaningful lyrics, which were kind of like social commentary of what was happening at the times. You could think of records like Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, The Message and White Lines. They're talking about the social conditions of the time and drugs that were infesting all the ghettos of the time. And this was all meaningful stuff. So for a few years, going through the 1980s, you had this art form that was bringing people together, was providing a very positive form of social cohesion, and was putting out the word as to what was going on in these inner city ghettos, But it didn't take very long until the corporations apparently realized that this was becoming a very powerful social art form, and they wanted their little slice of it. They wanted to start controlling it. They wanted to start making shitloads of money from it, and they wanted to start using it to shape and mold people's value systems and beliefs and all of this. So we had the emergence of what was known as gangster rap towards the end of the 80s at the hands of groups like NWA. And that's where the lyrics turned from being all about bringing people together and raising awareness of social conditions to gang banging. They were just talking about nigger this, bitch that, motherfucker this, toting guns, selling drugs, criminal lifestyles, basically. And this became a whole genre of the music. And then as the 80s gave way to the 90s, towards the end of that decade, you started to get materialism coming in at the hands of the likes of Puff Daddy and the artists on his Bad Boy record label. And it was the glorification of champagne lifestyles and talking about Versace suits and bling gold chains and, rims on your Jeep and all this kind of thing, partying up in the club with girls and throwing wads of cash up in the air, as you mentioned just there. And by this point, the entire genre had lost any kind of meaning that it once had, and it had just become a commercial money spinner for the corporations. It's got even worse now. I mean, if you think all that stuff was bad, look at what so-called hip-hop has become. I don't even refer to it as that, because whatever it is these days, it ain't hip-hop. It bears no resemblance to what went before. You got artists now, if you can even call them artists, just talking about, I don't even know what they're talking about. There's this aspect of it called mumble rap, where you have these artists just talking a whole load of crap. Nobody knows what they're talking about. You got auto-tune everywhere, this bloody awful electronic voice manipulation software. And the music has all become very satanic. It's what I call demonic sonics. The bass lines are just very discordant, very dissonant, don't make you feel good. And you've got agendas being pushed through it as well now, as well as transhumanism and artificial intelligence. This scene, believe it or not, has been used to normalize ideas of transgenderism. The LGBTQ community is being represented through this music. 20 years ago, this would never have happened. 20 years ago, if a hip-hop artist had come forward and announced that they were gay, they would have been laughed off the scene and ridiculed and never taken seriously again. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm not saying that's right. I'm not casting any kind of judgment here. I'm just pointing out that if this had happened 20 years ago, it would not have been accepted. And yet now it is. Now you have so-called rappers appearing in dresses. They have rainbow dyed hair, and they're pushing all these agendas, and everyone thinks it's just fine because of the way society has been conditioned and programmed and entrained to respond to social engineering programs. So when you look at what this genre now is, it's like a masterclass 101 study in how to get the job done, in how to entrain an entire generation in how to think. Because it's now aimed, all these bloody clowns and jokers we have are aimed, of course, at young people. They want teenagers and people in their early 20s to lap all this stuff up. People of my generation that remember better days, better times, better sounds, we're just completely irrelevant to the controllers now. We don't matter. They don't care what guys like me think and what guys like me say. because they're only interested in young people who are much easier to shape and mold and manipulate. And they've been doing that forever as well.
Yeah, as Vladimir Lenin said, he was talking about indoctrination in universities, saying, about pumping information into the soft heads of children. Give me 4 years to teach the children, and the ideas I've implanted will never be removed, or something like that. And also, what we were just talking there about, the effect on the black community in America. It actually, as an art form, it turned into something which is actually anti-black, because it introduces the racist terms that some of them will also complain about, like, nigger and bitches and all this stuff, which are horrible things. And as well as that, it even spilled out of the music industry. Even a casual observer like me has noticed that you'll get people like, say, for example, you'll get many black guys, famous celebrities, including people like, say, Floyd Mayweather, who will come out dressed like a rapper, with the caps and the gold chains, talking about money. And there's a clip of him on YouTube, because I'm an MMA fan, and I saw a clip of him talking about traveling somewhere, and I know he's a boxer, but it was on this website, and he's bringing all these gold watches, so the whole trashy gangster rap concept not only just affected hip hop, it also spread out into the whole black community in America, from what I can see.
And there's another thing to mention here as well, which is the situation with Afrika Bambaataa. Are you familiar with all that?
I recognize the name.
Okay, so there are 3 cult figures when it comes to hip hop culture who are acknowledged as having been the founding fathers of this whole scene. So that would be Kool Herc, who I mentioned, the early DJ. Grandmaster Flash, who's credited with having invented certain styles of turntablism and scratching back in the day. And this guy, Afrika Bambaataa, who has always been universally credited with having invented hip-hop culture. So he took it beyond just the musical aspect of things and made a whole lifestyle of it. And he became very influential. He had a big hit record in 1982 called Planet Rock. He had this performance outfit called the Soul Sonic Force. And he was the founder of this movement called the Universal Zulu Nation, which had its origins in sort of street gangs coming out of the Bronx area of New York, but has gone on to become a sort of quasi-religious cult, which has thousands, hundreds of thousands of members and different branches of it all over the world. He's been a highly influential and important figure when it comes to this whole scene. When you get into hip-hop, you're kind of entrained to revere this guy and see him as a guru. But unfortunately, his public image took a bit of a turn in 2016 when 2 individuals who had been a part of the Universal Zulu Nation going back to the late 1970s and the 1980s publicly accused him of having sexually assaulted them when they were minors. And since then, there have been various other people that have come forward as well. And they've said that it's been a well-known, best-kept secret within the Universal Zulu Nation that Afrika Bambaataa is a paedophile and that he has a preference for young boys. So there have been no charges brought against Bambaataa, whose real name would appear to be Lance Taylor. For many years, you would have looked on Wikipedia and it would have told you that his real name was Kevin Donovan. But a bit of sort of digging from various parties has turned up the fact that his name seems to be Lance Taylor. And then he adopted the pseudonym of Afrika Bambaataa. And it would appear that he's been up to this kind of activity all along. When you look at some of the symbolism and some of the regalia that's involved in the Universal Zulu Nation and some of his stage performances, you find all kinds of Freemasonic overtones. You find links to Egyptian symbology, which is very much favoured by many of these secret societies, what many would term the Illuminati, these control system networks that run everything. And you find all sorts of dark occult stuff going on as well, suggesting that there's rather more to know about Bambaataa. So a question becomes, if this guy has been held up since day one as one of the leaders of this entire art form, and he turns out to be, someone of this ilk. And by the way, the reason no charges have been brought against him is because by the time these guys came forward with their accusations, the statute of limitations in New York had long since passed. So there's a deadline by which you have to report an offence of this nature if any legal action is to be taken. And once that deadline passes, it's no longer admissible. That's how he's got away with it. There is a documentary that's due to come out very soon by an investigative journalist called Layla Wills, who's really thrown herself into this whole subject. It's due to be called Trapped in a Culture, and it's very, very imminent. And there's many different strands to the story as well. But for me, this casts a rather unsavory shadow over the entire art form. And when you factor in comments that were made by KRS-One, who's also been revered as a kind of spiritual leader of hip-hop and somebody that you're supposed to think of as being one of the founding fathers, he came to Bambaataa's defense when this story broke and made some comments that were very insensitive and pertained to him basically not caring that this is what Bambaataa was up to. He said it didn't take anything away from him. If you have a problem with him, you should get out of hip-hop. So now KRS-One, in the view of many, is tainted in a way that we didn't know about before. He's also made comments that hint at his involvement in Freemasonry. So really, how natural and organic was this whole scene from day one? Or do we have to face the uncomfortable possibility that there was Freemasonic and secret society and occult influence going all the way back to its early years? That's another aspect to the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of, it does kind of soil the whole image somewhat, especially for the hardcore fans. And speaking of symbology and stuff like that, if we can kind of just fast forward to the modern music industry, of course.
I'm loving the segues, man. The segues are working real nice.
Yeah. And, when we look at the modern music industry scene, like you brought up symbology there, I mean, this is ubiquitous. It's been around for so long, and it's everywhere in the industry. And it's still very prevalent today, and maybe even more so because of the internet, because of the big events like, the Super Bowl events, the MTV Music Awards. All these things have been singled out as featuring, occult secret society, Freemasonic, Illuminati symbology. So what kind of symbols should we be looking out for, Mark, in the modern music industry?
I did a Q&A video session earlier today, actually, which I'll be releasing in a couple of days. And I made the comment in that it's become a special event to find a contemporary pop video that doesn't contain occult symbology, aspects of trauma-based mind control, satanic ritual abuse, and all this other stuff. If you find a video where the imagery matches the lyrics and there's none of those elements present, it's a special event and it's something worth talking about. That's how ridiculous it's become. The occult signs and symbols that have been finding their way into videos have now become the norm. So you just expect to find them in there if you're paying attention. You see things like pyramids everywhere. You see all these hand symbols and signals, like the artists covering their right eye, signaling the fact that they've chosen the left-hand spiritual path. You find the so-called 666 sign being flashed up by all these artists, the Baphomet devil horns, all this sort of stuff. And I know many people will say that when you take an icon like a pyramid, it's not in itself evil. There's nothing nefarious about a pyramid. It's the context in which it's used. And when you do the research and when you look at articles on the Vigilant Citizen site, for instance, which is a great resource to understand all this stuff that's getting inserted into videos and also shows like the US Super Bowl halftime and the Grammys and the MTV Awards, because these things are just massive occult sigil fests. They've become ritual events. And when you know what you're looking for, it just becomes absurd because it's everywhere. Well, a pyramid has become a calling card for the control system that we have presiding over the entertainment industries. So it's their way of kind of announcing that they're behind these artists, they're behind these shows, these events, these videos, and they like to place their little calling cards in all these different aspects of what they do. A big part of it comes down to a tenet which they feel duty bound to observe, which is referred to as revelation of the method, or placing the truth in plain sight. So these occult secret societies that run all these industries are announcing to the general public what they're all about. And they're giving you little hints and pointers and clues as to the fact that they own these artists, and they're pushing all this stuff and all these agendas. They're giving us the opportunity to understand what's being done to us for those with the eyes to see. They do it in very veiled, shrouded, cryptic kind of ways, so that only those that have been entrained to recognize what's going on and have faced the due diligence to actually do the research and look at some of these resources to understand what all the signs and symbology are, only that small group of people are going to understand fully what's going on. For everyone else, all this stuff is going straight into their subliminal mind. So it's being absorbed into the subconscious. People are seeing it, but they're not fully understanding and processing what it is. So it's having an effect on them, and it can be affecting their thoughts and their emotions and their behaviors without them even realizing it's going on. This is how subliminals work. This is how hypnotism works. This is how advertising works when you get down to it, the science of that industry. But nevertheless, as they see it, they're giving us an opportunity to understand what it is they're doing. And the way they see it, when the rest of us voice no objection to it and basically just go along with it, they take that as our tacit, implied acceptance or approval of what they're doing. And they feel that this absolves them of any kind of karmic payback on their part because we've not said no. And to not say no is to tacitly say yes in their twisted, warped mentality. That really is why they do all this. And many scholars of this narrative will tell you the same thing. There's many researchers that are of the same view, and there's many former occultists as well that have come out of that whole scene that have said, yeah, this is absolutely why this stuff is done. So that's one of the reasons why you see all these signs and symbols everywhere. I think there's another element of it, which is mockery of the rest of us, the profane, as they see us. They love to mock the profane and rub our noses in it and kind of announce their control over things that way. But there's a few examples there anyway of what gets done.
Yeah, and I like how in the book you not only talk about the occult stuff, but also in the examples that you illustrated about how the stars perform at these big events, and the themes and the behaviour that they're pushing also ties in with the whole progressivism stuff that's sweeping across the Western world. And you outlined, quite accurately about, say, characters like, the Mouseketeers and the kind of these stars who start off with wholesome images being encouraged to be more sexual and very promiscuous and behave in that way, like in a morally degenerate way, on these big stages in front of the whole world, especially for young audiences to see. And we had, one of the examples you mentioned was, Madonna's kiss with Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera. So she's pushing, being lesbian, nothing really wrong with that much, but then also group sex and things like that are insinuated. And when you put those ideas in front of young kids who don't know any better, they start to think, oh, well, the celebrities are doing it, so I should do it as well.
Yeah, this is a classic way that they hook in a fan base for these artists. So they start out innocent and pure and nice and pleasant and family friendly. They did it with Britney Spears. They did it with Christina Aguilera. They did it with Justin Timberlake. All three of them were Mouseketeers out of the Mickey Mouse Club, part of the Disney Corporation, which unfortunately is up to its neck in dark occult, satanic ritual abuse and mind control programming, which absolutely flies in the face of its public image. And that's what you find so much in this wonderful world in which we live. If you want to get to the truth of a matter, you kind of have to do a 180-degree flip, a direct inversion of what we're being told by the mainstream. So, when a politician gets up there and says there'll be no more wars and taxes, you can take that as meaning there's going to be some new wars and taxes. So to find the truth of anything, You just have to look for the direct opposite. So Disney presents itself as being all about family values, but it's anything but when you get down to it. Miley Cyrus was also a product of Disney, of course, through Hannah Montana. She started out as this squeaky clean sort of girl next door that your parents would approve of. And then some way down the line, all of a sudden, they do the big flip on you and their entire persona changes. So the likes of Miley Cyrus and Britney Spears and all these others become anything but a squeaky clean, wholesome girl next door, and they start rocking these satanic slut images, particularly in the case of Miley Cyrus, where she's appearing on stage dressed up as a baby with a pacifier and diapers and stuff, simulating masturbation and pushing the sexualization of minors. It's deeply sick. They always do this. They give you an artist to win over the fans early on. Beyonce, when she first came out, made, innocent enough, catchy, pleasant R&B songs. It wasn't until some years into her career, when they put her together with Jay-Z, that it became obvious what her agenda had been. We even had this with the Beatles. If you think back to the early days of the Beatles, they came out with these boy meets girl pleasant love songs. She Loves You, Please Please Me, From Me to You, all this kind of stuff. It wasn't until their mid-period, around 1966, that they started putting out some of this experimental psychedelic stuff, and they started embracing LSD and pushing all these agendas that were going on at the time. So artists have always been used for this. And as you said, we've now got all these A-list household names being used to push certain social engineering agendas, including the promotion of transhumanism and the smart grid Internet of Things, artificial intelligence reality that we now have. Many artists are being used to glorify that and cultivate this idea among young people that technology is really great. It's your friend. It's the future. It's the way to go. Then you've got the transgenderism thing. And again, if attitudes towards these kind of lifestyles are genuinely coming from individuals themselves on their own terms, then that's a whole different thing. But when society is being coerced and manipulated and mind-controlled into adopting certain attitudes, that's a whole different thing, because it's now no longer on the terms of individuals. It's being forced on people. So we're now entrained to be entirely accepting of LGBTQ lifestyles and attitudes and all this kind of thing. And if you don't openly embrace it and you're not completely okay with it, you're branded as a bigot and a hater. It's hate speech, and you're shunned by all of polite society. Now, that's not a natural process. That's not coming from people's own mindsets and thoughts and attitudes. It's social engineering. It's been cultivated to be that way. These attitudes weren't in place 10 years ago, but they are now. So people have to ask themselves, where did all this come from? Did everyone in society all suddenly decide on their own terms that they were going to amend their attitudes to such things? And this happens with all fads, all trends, all movements. We've now got a push towards veganism. And this is a very alarming one for me. I made the personal choice a few years ago to become a vegan. I was vegetarian for about 30 years, or have been for 30 years, and I decided about 5 or 6 years ago I just wanted to become vegan. For me, the decision was entirely based on moral considerations and ethics. That's what it was all about. And it was a personal choice that I made for myself. Didn't try and force it on anyone else. Unfortunately, I can now see that there is a trend going on to entice and coerce people into adopting a vegan diet and lifestyle. And I know an agenda when I see one, and I can see all the signs. So I'm now asking myself why that would be. Why would it be in the interests of these social engineers to have large numbers of people suddenly adopting a vegan lifestyle? There's going to be an ulterior motive to it. I can't deny that there's an agenda going on. It doesn't change my stance on it. I'm not going to change for anything because it's a personal choice for me. But you've now got the likes of Beyonce and Jay-Z who are trying to coerce their fans into adopting this kind of diet and lifestyle. So, it's the latest one in their box of tricks, and we just have to ask ourselves why they're doing it at this time.
And we'll just to speculate on that one before we move to the last item quickly here. Perhaps the whole vegan thing is attached to somehow to the masculinity is under attack, and the ties in with the whole rebellion type of agenda that they know that especially with kids, if they try to turn vegan and they don't know what they're doing, especially young men, one of the things they can do is often mess around with their testosterone levels, and they're not getting fats and things like that. Not saying veganism is bad, but just in my experience, I'm talking to people over the years, if they don't know what they're doing, they can do it wrong, and maybe that could be one of the reasons, perhaps.
Well, I think it probably is, yeah, because if you don't study it properly, then you can fall foul to bringing the wrong kind of stuff into your diet, particularly soy, because soy is being marketed as the main alternative to meat products. And if somebody doesn't do their homework, they're just going to eat soy everything. And this has been linked with messing around with people's hormones, particularly males. It's supposed to have an estrogen mimicking component to it. And it's said that over long periods of time, it can feminize males. So this may well be part of it. And it just comes down to people doing their research and making the right decisions. It doesn't have to be that way, but for somebody that's uninformed, that could be the outcome, and this could be what they're banking on. And
just quickly, as for our last item here, just to try and inspire some research in the listeners, we're talking about this big, this industry, this control system that's been operating in front of people for so long, and they can't really see it. And as you pointed out, they're so affected by it and influenced by it, and it's right in their faces constantly, the same patterns over and over again. There have been individuals over the years who have kind of stepped out of line and who've kind of might have criticized the system, or the artists, who've trying to break free of their shackles. And we had a lot of mysterious deaths. And I remember Bob Dylan once saying that he made a bargain with the chief commander. So that's quite suspicious, isn't it? You've got big names and people like Prince, Whitney Houston, John Lennon dying in suspicious circumstances. So what's going on here?
Well, yeah, you do get artists who step out of line and go a bit off script from time to time, and they start making comments in interviews that their controllers would probably prefer they didn't make. And you can recognize these artists by the fact that they're dead. I can't help noticing that the ones that tend to be outspoken and try to inspire genuine social change just happen to, take overdoses and have heart attacks and get shot and this kind of thing. So, John Lennon became politically active and outspoken, and he's no longer with us. Paul McCartney, alive and well, fine. Don't find too many controversial comments from McCartney. So we have, George Michael, who went on the BBC's Hard Talk and was very critical of the Gulf War that was happening at the time, and he was critical of the Bush and Blair regime, calling them warmongers and all this, and just happened to die of a heart attack on Christmas Day, But Simon Le Bon of Duran Duran, alive and well, still going strong, no problem there. So there does seem to be a link between those artists who become a bit of a pain in the arse for the establishment and early deaths. Michael Jackson was very critical of the industry and the way record labels treat their artists, and he just happened to die of pharmaceutical drugs at the age of 50. And Prince was quite critical of record labels, and he started talking about chemtrails and all kinds of things on chat shows, and he just happened to die in a lift at the age of 57. So it seems that if you do what you're told, stay in line, and continue to be an asset of the industry which gave you your career, you can have a very long and prosperous life. Examples of that would be Sir Paul McCartney, Sir Elton John, Sir Tom Jones, Sir Mick Jagger, these kinds of people. But if you rock the boat a little bit, then you don't really tend to last that long. Prince, John Lennon, Bob Marley, George Michael, So we've had comments from the likes of Bob Dylan, but many others. Ozzy Osbourne's spoken of this. The Led Zeppelin guys have spoken of this. AC/DC. who else? Well, Katy Perry more recently, has made comments. All these artists have spoken of selling their souls for fame and fortune. So again, they're telling you what goes on. They're letting you know that the only way you get to become a household name and an influencer of culture like them is if you sell your soul. And people might take that term symbolically or metaphorically, or they might look at it literally, because there's a very real sense in which if you sign yourself over to these dark controllers, your life is no longer your own. You're doing what they say now. As long as you're happy to do that for the rest of your days, everything will be fine. But if you decide at some point down the line that it's a bit of a crappy deal, in the words of Kanye West, unfortunately, there's no way out unless it's the, Whitney Houston, Prince, Michael Jackson way out.
Yeah, and that's a good way to kind of finish, I suppose, is to just reinforce, how powerful the system is. And well, anyway, there's so much to talk about, but we've run out of time. So thanks very much for your time, Mark. And just as a last thing, I heard you've got a talk coming up in Acapulco in Mexico. Is that right?
Well, that's right, yeah. I'm going to be at Acapulco, which takes place from the 14th to the 17th of February. At the Princess Mundo Imperial Hotel in Acapulco, Mexico. Just in case anyone listening to this just happens to be out in Mexico at that time. You never know. This is a truly massive event. It's basically for the anarchist, voluntarist community, and it's all about personal sovereignty and empowerment and sort of unplugging from the governmental control system for people that want to take back some power into their own hands, So there's all kinds of lectures and workshops on these themes. Loads of speakers there. There's Ron Paul, David Icke, Cynthia McKinney, Andrew Napolitano. That's some of the headline names. There's other familiar names like Mark Passio, Max Egan, Ole Damagard, Derek Bros, these kinds of names. So I'm going to be doing a talk on the advocacy stage there about No More Heroes, lifetime actors and culture creation. I'm also going to be DJing at one of the parties out there. So as I say, if anyone happens to be in Mexico at the time, it's going to be a great event to attend. But other than that, I just wanted to try and leave this on a positive, inspiring note, because we've dealt with some pretty dark and devastating information over the course of the past hour, of course. And I don't want to send people away thinking, oh my God, this world is this horrible place that I never knew about, and we're all doomed. The first step towards reclaiming power for ourselves is to become aware of the tactics and the methods that have been used against us for so long. And I think it's incredible now that we're able to have conversations like this, and there's so many podcasts and radio shows of this nature. There's so many YouTube videos out there now. There's so many books. There's so many blog sites discussing the various ways in which we've all been deceived, in which we're enslaved, in which we're controlled by a very small handful of these elite ruling class individuals. As recently as certainly 20 years ago, and you can make an argument for even 10 years ago, there was very little public knowledge of this. So we've come a long way in a short period of time. And if you understand what's being done to you, then you are forearmed to take preventative action and to take the personal responsibility and make the personal choice to unplug from all of this and not be a part of it, and find ways to disassociate yourself from the control system overall. So I think it's a very encouraging thing that we are able to share this kind of information. We shouldn't let it get us down. We shouldn't get despondent about it. We should see it as hugely inspiring and putting us in a very good place to ensure that our future is going to be a lot better than would otherwise have been the case if this information was unable to get out. I hope that makes sense.
It does indeed, yeah. And as a last thing as well, I think it's no coincidence that we're seeing more madness in the world, and the control system is trying its best with all these new initiatives and censorship, because the internet has kind of started to level the playing field. So I suppose we should take it as a compliment that these things are happening, because what we do makes a big effort. And, this is the great work. I think that's introspective, spiritual self-work, but there's also the bigger picture thing as well of, helping other people to raise their consciousness, and this is as an important job as any other job. And so long may it continue. But listen, Mark, thanks very much for your time. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, no worries, man. It's been a good conversation, and I just leave people with the final thought that the old tricks aren't working like they used to. And it's because of shows like this and being able to share information like this. So it's a beautiful thing. So thanks for getting me on, man. I appreciate the opportunity, and best of luck to you in your future endeavours.
Excellent, brilliant. Thanks a lot, Mark Devlin. A real pleasure.
Thanks, man.
There you have it. That was my conversation with Mark Devlin, DJ and author of 2 great books on the dark side of the music industry, Musical Truth and Musical Truth Volume 2. Visit Mark's website and follow him on Twitter at DJ Mark Devlin. Subscribe to his YouTube channel, and also check out his great podcast called Good Vibrations. And all those can be found on his website, markdevlin.co.uk. Make sure to share this episode via your favourite social media or media platforms. Like, follow, share and subscribe. You can find all of those links on the Resolving Reality website. Also, don't forget you can now subscribe to Resolving Reality Radio on iTunes or Stitcher via your desktop or via the mobile apps. You can also download a high-quality WAV version of the episodes on the Resolving Reality SoundCloud profile. Also, keep an eye out for Resolving Reality videos, interviews and other pieces, which are coming soon and available on our YouTube channel, so please do like, comment, share and subscribe. For all those links, articles, audio and video content, visit www.resolvingreality.com. Thanks for listening to Resolving Reality Radio. We'll be back soon for our first episode of 2019. So until then, take care and enjoy Resolving Reality.